So I'm going to start us out by giving a brief background and overview, and then each of our panelists is actually going to give a presentation about their ranch, and then we're going to go right into audience Q&A, because we want to share as much as we can with you and then take questions and hopefully have a great discussion. So those of you in the room, how many of you have heard about the MARIN Carbon Project? Great. So some of what I'm going to say today may be repetitive, but I listened to it for about 300 times and I still think it's great, so I'm hoping it's not too boring. This is a slide that I drew out for a little project called The Soil Story, and it was a short 5-minute animated video, and it was really trying to serve the purpose of what are we talking about when we talk about soil as a climate change solution, and what are we talking about when we talk about agriculture as a climate change solution. And a lot of people don't know that there are 5 ways that carbon is stored on the planet. Often when we think about climate change, we think about smokestacks or we think about cars. And what I'd love all of you to do, which I know you already have the basis of, is to think about it as a global mechanism on which our planet is based. Carbon in the air is carbon dioxide, in the soil it's soil carbon, in the ocean it's carbonic acid, in terrestrial organisms it's carbohydrates. So I'm just going to invite you all to shift your thinking from sort of a linear, we're all about capping carbon emissions, to how do we move with the carbon cycle, and how do we move the carbon cycle. So I can skip through this. Terrestrially, the carbon cycle is mirrored very clearly with the plant. Wendell went over this morning, but very simply, all of the carbon in carbohydrates comes from the air and nowhere else. A lot of people forget this. We hear about carbon sequestration technologies. We have an incredible carbon sequestration technology that feeds us and clothes us in photosynthesis. So that carbon is not coming from the ground. As we know, it's coming from the air, and then it's going into the ground. Now, I put this up here, and this is a very smart and well-educated audience, so you'll forgive me for putting this in here, but the average person does not know this, right? So when we think about how we as humans act on the planet, we are unaware of how our consumption and our waste actually is in direct relationship with this really large global carbon cycle. But this little fact that the carbon and carbohydrates comes from the air seems to kind of put a light bulb off in people's heads. So I encourage you to use it if you're ever sharing this. Probably a lot of you have seen this. This is a simulation by NASA of carbon emissions during the winter over the globe, and this is during the late summer. So what's the difference in that? That's the photosynthetic capacity of the northern hemisphere. And so you can see that as a climate change solution, we have a potential already within our photosynthetic capacity. We're already drawing down carbon. So the idea is, can we draw down a little bit more carbon than we release every year? Can we store more of it in the soil? The MARIN Carbon Project initially did a survey to see if you could increase soil carbon storage on 30 sites in MARIN. And what they found was not that there was a huge difference on grazing, although definitely in our above ground organic matter there was a big difference, but below ground they did not see a huge difference in the soil carbon pools. What they saw was a very large difference in soil carbon based on if those ranchers had been applying manure historically or not. And in fact, that difference was so large that it caused them to ask this question of, would a topical application of an organic amendment actually increase durable soil carbon? And so the MARIN Carbon Project was formed with the MARIN Resource Conservation District and the other agencies that you see up here. The science was led by University of California, Berkeley Silver Labs, and the choice to use compost was actually recommended by Dr. Jeffrey Creek, a rangeland ecologist. So they weren't testing this from a fertility standpoint. They weren't testing this from, can we grow more grass? They were testing this from a, if we put carbon on top of the ground, will it help more carbon end up in the ground question. They were told very early on that any science that they did or any product that they produced must be replicable, scalable, and generally applicable. They also have 2 principles, I think, which is the basis of their success. One is to utilize existing infrastructure wherever possible, and to always use solid science. The science that they produced was really groundbreaking and helped us move forward on a lot of policies in California to support this work. What did we find? We found that organic amendments increased a lot of changes in net primary productivity, which increased soil carbon above and below ground. We saw this extended over time. We actually now have this time series out through 2015, and even during the California drought, we saw those plots that had been amended with compost 7 years later, still having more carbon come into the system and increasing in grass production. The models that we use with Colorado State University predict that this response, barring any sort of fire or major disturbance, will continue to 30 to 50 years. And this is the big thing for us in terms of the rancher community. Forage production increased between 30 and 70%, depending on if you were in the Marin headlands or up in the Sierra Nevada foothills, where this was also tested. And that's from a one-time application of compost. This is not compost every year. This is putting down a ½ inch of compost once. You saw this response over time. There's been 10 peer-reviewed and published papers. There's about 4 more papers in review. So you can read all the science if you want, or sometimes I just use this graphic because it kind of just says that, which is putting, amending the soil with compost and a rangeland system, increased soil water holding capacity, increased above and below ground biodiversity, and net primary productivity. And it increased net carbon sequestration. So really quickly, the frameworks that I wanted to share with you, they built this whole system of carbon farming on top of the traditional NRCS conservation practice framework. So people, when they hear about carbon farming, they can mean a lot of different things. To us in California, it's taking 34 practices that are already identified by the NRCS to increase above and below ground carbon, and then managing your conservation plan around increasing carbon on your farm and ranch. They also developed a protocol for carbon offsets. We developed a tool to calculate and estimate your carbon reductions called the Comet Planner. That's also a national tool that's now been calibrated for each state. We created the fifth, and I say we broadly, it's a huge group of organizations. The California now recognizes natural and working lands as its 5th pillar of its climate change strategy, which is a big deal because that laid the groundwork for the Healthy Soils Initiative, which was taking funding from our cap-and-trade system. We have a cap-and-trade system in California, and moving those dollars to ranchers for these practices. So the first year, $7.5 million was allocated. The grant program has some bugs we've got to work out, but that's money now that's going to come out of the state fund to farmers on an ongoing basis to support this work. There's the comp planner. You can go online and you can find your area and put in your ranch and be like, I'm going to put compost down on this many acres, or riparian restoration. There's all these other practices you could do, and you can get an estimate, area estimate of your carbon sequestration potential. Something that we did that was really important, and I'm definitely looking for other people who are interested in this. We're hopefully going to be doing it in California. Love to see it done in New Mexico, maybe up in Montana. Is we did the field trials with the NRCS, and compost on rangelands is not an approved conservation practice. But we're taking it through the practice protocol development process through field trials. At the same time, we're taking the science team that did the original Marin Carbon Project science, and we're replicating that on different landscapes and different climates and biomes across the state of California. All these places where there's a little blue dot was an NRCS field trial. So we took the NRCS practice protocol, and then we combined it with the Marin Carbon Project science. Each one of the ranchers here today is one of those sites. So I'm really happy everyone's here. We also expanded out carbon farming planning capacity through some of the partner organizations in this work. The Carbon Cycle Institute has trained over 33 resource conservation districts on how to do carbon farm planning in their area. We have a climate beneficial ag co-op that just was launched last week through the Fibershed project. They have over 140 ranchers and mostly sheep and cattle that have come together to pool their resources to help create market value for their products. And then there are a number of organizations like Point Blue, who spoke this morning, and several others on the landscape that are all engaged in this work of creating healthy soils in California. Feel free to ask questions afterwards. I'm just going to put this as my last slide up here. This is what my colleague John Wick always says, which is that agriculture is the business of moving carbon between those different carbon pools to produce food, fuel, fiber, and flora. And if we do it correctly, we can do it in a way that balances out the global carbon cycle. So now I'm going to introduce one of our star ranchers, Russell Chamberlin from Santa Barbara.
Thank you, Calla Rose. It's a real pleasure to be here, folks. You guys are my mentors. I've learned everything from you, so it's a real honor to be up here. My grandfather bought our ranch back in 1929, California. We're in Santa Barbara County. We get about 12 to 15 inches of rainfall annually. Here's a picture of families. We can carry about one cow for 15 to 20 acres in our country. And my grazing goal is to maximize the forage production, increase the soil carbon and soil water holding capacity, protect the water quality, improve pasture nutritional profile, and increase the length of the grazing season. In 2014, I had a great opportunity to start the program or become a part of the program called Rancher to Rancher. And this is an opportunity where we have small test sites on the ranches, and it's a place where ranchers can play with different grazing practices, different densities, herd densities, and see what impacts that we can have there. The slide on the left there is in 2014 when we started. We're having a big drought in California, so we're only got about 7.5 inches of rainfall. Then the following, and during this period of time, I'm almost embarrassed to show this slide now with so much bare soil there. And this is a big turning point in our grazing plan, in our family, in our management style. So this is actually becoming kind of a sensitive slide for me now as we're moving forward with our grazing plan. In 2015, the slide to the right there, we had about the same amount of rainfall, but we had a lot more forage growth inside the exclosure there. That's where we're practicing our grazing, and then we have a larger pasture on the outside. In 2016, we had some more rainfall, about 11 inches, and then 2017, we had almost double the amount of annual rainfall that we've had. So each year we've been doing this, we've been seeing improvements. Here's a picture of some of our cattle in the test site. I just have them in there for a short amount of time. I've been doing it during the summertime and just trying to graze about half of our dry forage and then get the rest of it trampled onto the ground for all the wonderful reasons that you guys know about. Trying to protect that soil from temperature, trying to feed those soil microorganisms, trying to put that manure down there, that urine down there, and also protect it from the rainfall. I'm really, as I said, trying to not have any more bare soil. During the growing season, trying to get the cattle to rotate to the ranch much quicker and just graze the top third of the plant off and keep it growing in a photosynthesis state. And when we're producing photosynthesis, then we're capturing that carbon down into the soil. So I'm really not looking to measure my annual rainfall so much anymore. I'm really interested in making sure every single drop of rain that comes down, that I'm capturing it, and it's not evaporating, it's not going down to my neighbors. I've seen a lot of changes this last year just from our grazing practices, which I was talking about. Pretty much my whole life I've never seen saplings from our coastal live oak trees. This last year I've seen about 500. So I'm really encouraged just by that sign. On the right there, that's a photograph of perennial grasses taken in August. Typically, they're all dried up, and you might see just a little bit of green at the base of them. I don't have to explain too much about this slide with you folks, because you all know about the benefits of grazing. However, this is our property right-hand side of the slide with planned grazing and non-planned, and the side on the left is not grazed. That's our neighbors over there. It's been non-grazed for about 15 years, and the people who say, cattle shouldn't be on rangelands, it just harms it, they're not benefiting it. Well, I don't see any seedlings coming up there. I don't see the perennial grasses over there. And on our side of the fence, with all the wild oats that are coming up, this is one of our riders out there. There's places I couldn't even take the photograph for her because I couldn't find her in the wild oats. I was like, Kristen, can I move forward? I can't find you. And wild oats is one of the indicator species that our soils are improving. We were very fortunate in 2016 to be able to get a carbon farm plan done by Dr. Jeff Borum, the former executive director and coach for the RCD, and myself. In our carbon farm plan, we have about 13 different practices identified, and we're working on 2 of those practices. One is grazing, and the other one is applying compost to rangeland. Now, when you're applying compost to rangeland, yeah, we're going to get more forage growth, and as we all know, grazing is critical to that. So we don't want to be applying compost and get more forage growth without the proper grazing practices that go with it. So on each of our properties, we have an exclosure here, and then right down the center of the screen on the left-hand side is what got compost applied, and the right-hand side is the control group. So we have one site with NRCS, and then we have a second site with Dr. Josh Schimmel from UCSB and Dr. Wendy Silver from UC Berkeley. This is just a 1/4-inch compost application, and it's modeled to last for about 20 to 30 years. One-time application is pretty amazing. Some of the results you can see here, underneath my right hand is where the compost was not applied, and underneath my left hand, that's where compost was applied. We saw a 16% increase in forage production. Many of the places in the Marine Carbon Project was seeing 50 to 70% increase in forage production. Why it's not so much this year on our property, I'm not too sure. Might have been because we had kind of an abundance of rainfall. Maybe everything did very well, but it'll be interesting to see what happens next year. And there is still little pieces of compost out on the land when we go take a look at it. So what are some of the benefits from this? As far as sequestering carbon, when we look at in the top column there, after 20 years, it would sequester 98,000 metric tons of carbon, and then at maturity, it would sequester 162,000 metric tons of carbon. And we have an 8,000 acre cattle ranch, and it's estimated that we could put carbon down on 4,200 acres. The rest of it is either the slopes are too steep, there's too much brush, or too much tree cover. So we take all those aspects into configuration as well. Now, I kind of like to break down, what does 98,000 metric tons of carbon mean? I mean, to me, it doesn't mean a whole lot as far as a number. But if you look at how much a car pollutes, it pollutes about 5.5 metric tons of carbon annually. And we're sequestering about 1.49 metric tons of greenhouse gases a year. So it takes about 3.7 acres of land to sequester the equivalent of the offsets of one car. So I feel pretty good about waking up in the morning and all the emissions that are being offset by this type of program, and all our grazing practices that we're doing by encouraging photosynthesis. We also look at the water holding capacity. We're increasing that. So after 20 years, we'll have 493 additional acre feet of water that was held in the soil. This all can be possible if you're not monitoring for it. So on the carbon sites with the compost, we're looking at monitoring for carbon, soil biology, percent organic matter, water infiltration rate, and so much more. I don't even understand all the science that's going into it. On the rancher sites, we're looking at monitoring the water cycle, the mineral cycle, the energy flow, and the community dynamics. Management is key. I like what holistic management, I believe is, what they say is get the cattle to the right place at the right time for the right reasons. I've learned so much about collaboration. This type of program can't happen without collaboration with so many people, folks within this room, the RCDs, the NRCS, There's also a couple other great philanthropic, can't pronounce that, in Santa Barbara County. The Santa Barbara Foundation, they've been very helpful and very supportive, as well as the Community Environmental Council. And one other unique person that we're working with too is the Santa Barbara Air Quality Control District. Now, most ranchers in my area would run the other way as soon as I mention that word. But it's nice. We're working hand in hand. We have common goals, and so we're able to come together. Thank you.
Good job, Russ. First of all, I want to thank the Quivira Coalition for inviting me out to this great conference, and thank you, Calla Rose, for even considering me to be on this panel with these other esteemed speakers. I know if I go ad lib here that I will go over the 10 minutes that I'm allotted, so I'm going to stick quite closely to my script here. I wanted to go in a little bit different direction with my presentation, and I wanted to talk a little bit more about the economic potential of carbon farming. You're going to hear some of the other panelists talk about the actual carbon farming practices, but I wanted to try to get you into my mindset of where I see the benefits and the potential from an economic perspective in carbon farming and carbon ranching. And I'm going to piggyback on the words of Alan this morning and say it's all about the incentive. To give you a little bit more background on myself, I did not grow up in a ranching family. I graduated from the University of San Diego with a degree in business, and I played baseball there for 4 years. My journey into regenerative agriculture started really with my sports nutrition and a desire to fuel myself with the best nutrition possible, mostly grass-fed beef, and I was a huge paleo nut. When I realized the glaring issues in our food system, I decided to take upon myself to create business solutions for the issues that we were facing. In June of 2016, I purchased 80 acres with some investment capital because I didn't own a ranch. Later that year, through the help of Calla Rose and her team at the Carbon Farming Project, I spread a 1/4 inch of compost on half an acre of my land, and thus begun the carbon farming trials on my 80 acres. Shortly thereafter, I was able to secure a contiguous lease of 2,500 acres right next door to me, which was my plan the whole time. I knew ranching wasn't going to be successful on just 80 acres. With my business partner, Roger Savory, we started to holistically graze 40 cow-calf pairs on that 2,500 acres. We started a cover cropping program where we seeded about 300 acres of a multi-species cover crop with a no-till drill. All new stuff to me because I had ranched before, but it was fun thinking about how much life I was creating, spreading all that seed on 300 acres. We were well on our way to developing the soil health on the ranch along the guidelines of best management practices for regenerative agriculture. In July, we lost our lease on the 2,500 acres, so now I'm looking for a new business opportunity. So this is the point where I want to convey to you of how I'm evaluating those opportunities in the world of regenerative agriculture. I'm currently putting together a business plan that incorporates the best management practices of what we're talking about up here, carbon farming and regenerative agriculture, but I'm also looking for the benefits of payment for ecosystem services. It is my belief that without the incentive of direct payments for ecosystem services, we're not going to see the speed and acceleration of topsoil generation without these direct payments. So enter the Warner Springs Ranch. The Warner Springs Ranch is 43,000 acres smack dab in the center of Southern California. The property is owned by the Vista Irrigation District. And no, they do not have a 100-year plan for their secured water source. Thought that was really impressive that you guys have one here. This whole ranch, as you can see here, drains into the Lake Henshaw Basin right here, which the Vista Irrigation District put a dam, I think back in the 1920s. So this whole catchment drains into this one catchment pond right there. The ranch has been leased out for the past 40 years by a rancher by the name of Heinz Hedega, a dairyman, and it's on a year-to-year basis, and he pays about $200,000 a year for the lease. Now, Heinz has been set stocking his animals for this time period, and the organic matter levels for the ranch are about 1.5%. My whole pitch to the Vista Irrigation District is that they could be saving lots of money if they were to increase soil organic matter and if they were to get their soils covered through regenerative agriculture practices. So the Vista Irrigation District purchases about 80% of their water, and they get about 20% from domestic sources. The cost is about 4 cents per gallon of the water that they do purchase from the Colorado River in Northern California. They purchase this 13,587 acre-feet of water from the county authority, and they only have 3,800 acre-feet of local production, meaning the water that's draining into here is only 3,800 acre-feet. So again, 80% they're purchasing. Now we know through regenerative agriculture practices that we can increase the carbon in our soils, and we know that a 1% increase in organic matter is a 25,000 extra gallon storage capacity. I know there's some figures that sort of go back and forth, whether it's 26 or 25, and I heard from Wendell's presentation this morning, 17. I'm going to go with 25 because it's right in the middle. So 25,000 gallons times 43,000 acres across the Warner Springs Ranch is roughly 1 billion gallons of water. But we also know through the work of ranchers like Alan Williams and from his presentation this morning that organic matter increases of 4% are possible, especially over a long time period. So let's assume 4% increase conservatively. Now that number just turned into 4 billion gallons of water. The next way we can increase the water budget would be to get the soils covered. Well, how do we get our soils covered? We use carbon farming practices to do so. Most of you know these practices, so I won't spend too much time on this. But we use cover crops, planned grazing, the spreading of compost to produce more biomass, to get more biomass down on the ground. And we start to see the benefits of that. Now, research out of the country of Namibia, and I got this from my business partner, Roger Savory, and the body of research coming from the Savory folks says that when a bare raindrop falls on uncovered soil, about 80% of that water evaporates into the atmosphere. 10% of that water sinks into the soil and 10% flows off. With covered soil, that equation is reversed. 80% of the water sinks into the soil, 10% evaporates, and 10% flows off in the form of a slow seep. Now let's do the math on that. At the Warner Springs Ranch, we have about 18 inches of rain per year. And with 18 inches of rain per year, that equates to about 27,000 gallons of water per acre. Times 443,000 acres gives us 1.16 billion gallons of water. With bare soil, we're losing 80% of that. With covered soil, we're saving 934 million gallons of water. And now I know, after going over these figures, why irrigation districts deal in acre feet, because it's really hard to say some of these gallon numbers. All right, so what are the lowest hanging fruits for increasing organic matter on our farms and ranches? The 4 practices that I want to highlight here, got my numbering system messed up there, but are compost application, cover crops, planned grazing, and fertilizer applications. You guys can do your own research on the cover crop, planned grazing, fertilizer applications. There's plenty of material on YouTube to educate you on that. But the compost application, I feel like, is really interesting. I feel like it's the lowest hanging fruit because it's the easiest to do. And anybody with a slinger can get out there and go spread some compost. And if the compost is good and biologically active, then we're going to see some results. With the other stuff, it takes a bit more education, it's a bit more technical, but we know that works quite well and can be done profitably. The thing with the compost application right now is that we have to do some work in the policy realms for us to make this more affordable to ranchers. So that's why the work of Calla Rose and Kevin and Russell, and all of us up here that have our carbon farming plans is so important so that we convince policymakers to incentivize ranchers to do this great work. So the final math here, about $8 million worth of savings in purchased water that the Vista Irrigation Water District would save. Now I know there's a lot more scientifically adept ways at analyzing this. This was my simple rancher way to equate water savings to the Vista Irrigation District, because I want at least 43,000 acres and make something happen. But that's why we're working, and hopefully we will be working with groups like the Point Blue, Conservation Science, so that they can equate these things for real. Another gentleman that's doing some great work is Abe Collins, who I believe was presented here at the Quivira conference before. He's got a project called Landstream that's using next generation technology, such as the soil information system from Trimble Agriculture, developing precision mapping for water infiltration rates across really wide landscapes. He's using dual head infiltrometers that are much more efficient than the manual ones that we've been using currently. And so I'm excited to experiment with these types of technologies, but we need more investment capital for these technologies because they're quite expensive right now. I just spent a couple days out on Gabe Brown's ranch with Abe, and we took about 100 different soil cores, about 4 feet deep, with the soil information system. And I won't tell you the bill, but he's raising investment capital through donations. But if he was able to really put together a sound business plan and get his work funded, we would be able to really drive down the cost for ranchers to start equating their properties. So the goal is not total watershed quantification. It's total, what was the word, Wendell, that we used earlier today? New word for watershed?
Catchment.
Water catchment quantification. So if we can quantify the amount of water, the amount of carbon that we're sinking into the groundwater tables, the amount of wildlife we're providing habitat for, then I think that creates an added revenue stream for ranchers. And even if we didn't get this $8 million of water saved, let's just say we got $1 million of that, and we split that 50-50 with the Vista Irrigation District, I think a lot of us here in that room would take an extra $500,000 for our enterprises. So, thank you.
Our last panelist is Kevin Watt, who I'm really happy he's here. He flew out today and flies back tonight. He's a member of the California RCD Board, and they're having their annual conference. So thanks for joining us, Kevin.
Hi, everybody. It is genuinely my pleasure. I've been in this audience for the last 4 years, and it's really an honor to be up on this stage. I also work for TomKat Ranch, and that's sort of the lens through which I'll be speaking. I had previously served as the integrated land and livestock manager there, and now I work in sort of strategy and outreach and policy, because as we sort of switch from an internal focus, now it's finding that these tools are incredibly valuable for other people and that we can help to scale, but also to democratize this, because as we were just hearing, it's costly. So I'll first introduce some context. So TomKat Ranch is an 1,800-acre ranch. We're in Pescadero, California, about an hour south of San Francisco. We have about 700 acres of coastal prairie and about 1,100 acres of scrub and forest land. Incredibly diverse working landscape, but it's also home to our educational foundation of the same name, with the mission to provide healthy food on working lands in a way that sustains our planet and inspires others to action. So normally we'd be talking about the first half of that. How are we providing healthy food on working lands? What are the amazing sort of innovations there? But you've all heard that, and I don't want to preach to the choir. I want to grow the choir. So we're going to focus on my favorite part, which is the inspiring others to action, because of the way that our foundation was sort of formed, we have two donors. We have Tom and Kat. And that has given us this amazing ability to focus solely on just what works, on what is sort of agnostically proven to make this landscape more productive and more resilient, and then share that, because we don't want to legislate people to action or guilt them to action. That we want to inspire them to action. Others might, that's perfectly fair. So currently our work is focusing on inspiring the transition of 1 million acres of California's grasslands to regenerative management. This idea that every year, every season, these working landscapes are becoming more productive and more resilient, which is, to many audiences, a very audacious a goal. To a holistically trained audience, it sounds like a totally no-brainer. We've sort of split it up into 3 areas, though. The regenerative ranching program is, working on finding and sharing those demonstrable benefits, that quantification, and supporting tools that help to spread it. Our education and outreach is really focused on teaching and on convening, the audiences that don't normally get to cross-pollinate. And our Food for Good work is, really trying to grow that market for these regenerative products, because that business bottom line is what will really accelerate scaling. So regenerative ranching, though, isn't a given, and as many of you know who have neighbors and who provide amazing fence line photos, it's often hard to understand, well, how do you come into this mindset? Some people do it through bankruptcy, some people are just lunatics, and that's fantastic because that's why we're here. We started because the ranch, when it was purchased by TomKat, was so ecologically distressed from decades of over-farming, over-ranching, scraping and selling topsoil, dumping cars into the creek, which locals say was only $20, so it's a pretty good deal. And so this really led us to a point where sustainable management wasn't even on the table. We had to regrow this landscape. And that led to this really, really passionate search for what works. How do you take a landscape and bring it back to life? The key, as you all know, is photosynthesis. And it really takes an amazing paradigm shift. And this is why so many people don't do this. It's an exponential function. I mean, nature is so complex, so interrelated and interdependent that our primate brains, which are very good at linear thinking, are completely baffled by these sort of exponential growth or exponential decline functions. As you might have already heard, that dimes width of soil is 10 or 10 tons lost per acre per year. I mean, that's astonishing, but similarly, growing 1 more ounce of forage per square foot, that's 2,700 pounds of extra forage. So what we really found was, if we can increase photosynthesis, we can grow the organic matter, get more water holding capacity, and then grow even more photosynthesis next year. Our Tom and Kat are bankers, so for us the idea of compounding interest was not a dramatic leap, but it was one that we were really excited to see because it's incredibly accessible. It's something that you can start now. The best tool for the job are cows or our goats or our sheep or is agriculture, and that's what is so exciting is the thing that degraded this landscape can actually grow it back. And this is a huge, huge challenge for a lot of folks who are very heartfelt feelings about conservation and environmentalism, is they're looking at agriculture and they're seeing that, yes, human beings, this is our #1 way that we interact with the natural world, and our capabilities have very quickly outstripped or outpaced our perspective. So we're kind of driving this giant bulldozer, but we have a blindfold on and we're causing havoc. But we can use that to do really amazing things too. And so for us, the whole regenerative ranching and regenerative agriculture sort of process comes down to one driven by feedback. It's setting those audacious goals, those nonlinear goals. It's executing, in our case through grazing. It's really rigorously tracking what you've done, because as somebody who has grazed for years, you tell yourself a very rosy story about some of the horrible mistakes that you've made. But if you write it down, or if you have a very honest wife, you remember everything. And then ultimately you monitor in a very sensitive way to see if you're moving towards your goals, but almost more importantly, if those are the right goals. So at TomKat Ranch, we've been really blessed with our funding that, we have Point Blue Conservation on site. We have an amazing group of stakeholders. So when we do grazing planning, we can pour through the research, we can set goals. And what you see here is our grazing plan that gets posted onto our website. Blue is our sort of land goals. Purple, I believe, is education and outreach. Green is biodiversity. Orange is production. And we go through with all of our stakeholders what our goals are, what the literature or what our community or what has been demonstrated says, and then how we're going to actually execute it. In terms of the grazing, as many of my fellow sort of California grazers will say, it's really about keeping that photosynthesis going for as long as possible, because we get rain, but it all comes at once. So it's about keeping it pruned and growing during the spring, and in the fall and winter, mulching it and armoring of that soil. In terms of tracking, we got one of those big 3x5 charts because we mark it up. And in terms of monitoring, participating in Point Blue's rangeline monitoring network has given us phenomenal insight into our land. And in fact, we post also on our website all of our ecological data that we use for our planning processes. We've seen great successes. 3 seasons after starting planned grazing, we went from 5 fields on the property having any natives and perennials to 57, and then the following year, all of the field. We also did an LCA, which is a presentation in and of itself, so I'm so sorry that I'm going to just breeze through it, but that we did an LCA that looked across these 10 impact areas and compared our operation to a modeled California beef operation that has a similar climate and also does cow-calf and stocker and finishing, and found that the conventional model is essentially, costing California in societal value, namely through greenhouse gases, water consumption, water pollution. But the regenerative model that we were practicing, using our primary data, we could see, there's extra, there's positive animal welfare, nutrition, reduced water consumption. But if you notice that little green sliver for our greenhouse gases, we flip it to where this model is greenhouse gas positive, which is monumental. So how do we scale this? How do we democratize it? Well, you've probably seen outside in terms of tracking, there are a lot of amazing tools out there. We love PastureMap. It works really, really well for our operation. For monitoring, we've been evaluating a tool out of the UCross High Plains Stewardship folks that is using Landsat data to measure the photosynthesis over the sort of annual growing season and then make comparisons to surrounding areas. So here you can see our ranch over the years that we've done planned grazing compared to the conservation land, the conventional grazing land, all of the rangelands in our area. Very, very cool tool. And in a few years, I hope we'll be able to show you all something more concrete. But carbon farm planning, I have a minute left for this, so this is my fate. But carbon farm planning, we think, is the tool for scaling how we do holistic planning and setting these big goals. Because a lot of people out there aren't ready to do holistic sort of optimization-based planning. So if they're going to keep maximizing it and using very reductionist thinking, we might as well have them maximizing the thing that's at the center of so many processes on the farm and on the ranch. RCDs, the NRCS, amazing allies in this space. We did our plan. It was a really neat opportunity to not only see what our possibilities were, but what the opportunity costs were, where the biggest bang for the buck is. So now, not only do we have this tool for sort of changing the planning side, but the grazing tools change. Yes, we still have planned grazing, but we can also do compost application, or the big one that kind of surprised us all. We can do the riparian area restoration, which has the potential to nearly quadruple carbon sequestration on the ranch. So it's a phenomenal opportunity. I'm happy to be up here already. Thank you very much.
up for audience questions, I'm just going to give a little context because I realized I rushed into it. In California, we use the climate change frame very specifically because we have a funding pool that we're trying to access at the state level. It might not be that way in other places. You might have different mechanisms that you want to utilize to try to get funds down to farmers and practices. But the model that I think is so powerful that was built out of the MARIN Carbon Project and then now scaled across the state is taking this existing infrastructure of the resource conservation districts or the soil and water conservation districts that can provide technical assistance, taking the conservation planning process and professionals, range and otherwise, and then using that to plan around carbon, using EQIP funds and SIG funds to do that work, and then layering on what we have now in California, which is the Healthy Soils Initiative funding. So we've got federal level funding, we've got state level funding, and then on the market side, we're trying to develop also value-added products. The North Face just launched its California Wool Beanie, which had a premium of 60 cents per pound of wool placed on it for its climate beneficial attributes. And it's been their best-selling beanie thus far this year. So we're trying to create 3 different income streams for farmers to be able to implement these practices. And that's just enough to try to get it on the ground. We're going to need a lot more to get it going. But that's sort of the framework. And then these 3 gentlemen here represent very different ranches and very different approaches to ranching. However, they all have carbon farm plans or have done that process. And we're all part of our field trials, which we did with the NRCS. So that's just a little bit of our basic context. And I wanted to open up now to any questions from the audience.
Corey, actually, I've got this one first.
Yes, hello. My name's Eike. I'm from Germany, and in Germany, the increase of organic matter in soils has been an object of research for almost 150 years. And when I see that with the on the table that Russell presented, the carbon sequestration, and I was assuming it's meant to be in the soil, is more or less linear over time. So you're increasing soil carbon over 20 years. All the research that we've had in Germany has come out to a point where every soil type has its balance of how much organic matter it can carry. And beyond that, it has to be either charcoal type carbon that you sequestrate, which you're probably not doing with compost, and or it needs to be deep plowed, like 5 feet deep or deeper, and then it will be retained over 50 years and longer. So how do you actually sequestrate so much carbon? And you were talking about tons, and I wasn't sure about the area. Maybe it was your whole ranch, or so that was not really clear. But how do you increase carbon in linear form? I mean, it's going to turn into an organic soil after a while, or you have to bury it very deep.
So the slide that he referenced was a printout from his carbon farm plan. I would suggest that you go look at the Comet Planner tools, which is a suite of tools from Colorado State University. They cite all the literature within that tool, so you can look at what they're citing. In California, we are working with soils with organic matter under 1%, and we're seeing farms that are able to increase that up to 12%. So we have a pretty wide bar in terms of saturation capacity for our soils when it comes to organic matter. The other thing that I think I'll point out is that the compost research actually showed that 1.5 tons per hectare of carbon is actually in durable soil carbon pools. So that's not in the labile carbon pool. That's in these the occluded light fraction and heavy carbon pools. So we are looking at long-term carbon storage in those heavier fractions. But in terms of the specific research and how the model works, I would encourage you to go ahead and look into the Comet Planner. All the literature is cited on the tool.
Over here on your right. You guys talked about putting on a 1/4 inch or a 1/2 inch of compost. I'm wondering how many tons per acre that equates to, and then the cost per acre associated with that as well.
I don't remember how the breakdown of the tons, but it's about 34 cubic yards per acre. And then you can figure out the moisture content of your compost to figure out that part. And we're working on the cost to get it applied per acre. Those are some calculations that we're working on right now to see how that we can build this up and scale this model up. So stay tuned and we'll be working on that.
Yeah, the price for compost in California varies between about $15 to $80 per cubic yard, depending on the type and source of compost. I got some figures out of Colorado that were like $4.50, $8. So it just depends in terms of your cost. But that is the main barrier right now, is the supply of compost and the cost of compost. Usually the cheapest way to do it is to make your own.
Hey, I was just gonna ask if there's been any kind of, or any possibility or any research that you found that for any possible consequences of maybe pulling too much carbon into the soil. I don't know if, you know, like you have nitrogen poisoning, could that same thing be with carbon?
Gosh, I don't think that I'm qualified to say. I haven't seen any research on that. I think we have lost so much soil carbon from the type of agriculture that we've had for the past couple of centuries that we have a long way to go just to get back to parity. And I think we're seeing some pretty intense consequences from too much carbon in the atmosphere and too much in the oceans. So at this point, I don't see carbon as a negative. When it's in the soil, it's a stacking function for the hydrological and nutrient cycles. So when you get more carbon in the soil, you tend to also balance out those other cycles. So if anything, I think we're seeing a positive impact. Now, how long that carbon sticks around, how much you can increase it before you reach a saturation point, these are all questions that are out there. But I think that we have to be really careful not to let the perfect be the enemy of the good in this case. And we have to move forward with what we know in a careful and cautious manner. We're not advocating putting compost everywhere. We're advocating putting compost on degraded soils in plant communities that's appropriate.
We're here in the back right.
Yeah, can you speak to the nature of the compost that you use? You know, if you have forested land and you have some waste wood product, you can use that. Is it manure? And also, what are the methods of spreading the compost? I heard somebody say a slinger, but I don't know what that is. Are there other methods? What is the, you know, what is kind of, I guess you already addressed the cost, but, you know, maybe there's some other aspects of that, like how much time it takes and things like that.
Well, I can answer part of that. Mainly the compost has got to go the thermophilic process, meaning the heating process. So it's got to be heated up for, I think it's 15 days for a certain temperature. I think it's like 120 degrees. So it kills all the pathogens and all the weed seeds. As far as your stock material that's going to be in there, it could be wood chips, garden material, manures, things like that. One of the things that you want to look at is your carbon to nitrogen ratio. As far as applying compost on the rangelands, we're doing a little bit lower nitrogen ratios than what somebody might put on a broccoli field per se. We're not trying to get high nitrogen ratios out on the field where you're going to all of a sudden get a big growth of grass. We're looking at getting more carbon on there, so it's going to be like a slower release and building up that carbon bank and food for the microorganisms.
And in terms of the infrastructure, what we were basically using was a side slinging manure spreader. And that did the trick. It was fantastic.
Question on the left here.
Hi, thank you for your presentations. Have you compared, perchance, the business outcomes and the carbon sequestration potential between grassland or pasture and forest lands? And what would make more business sense and what would store more carbon. And I presume that might be most beneficial on the more humid side of the ecosystems.
There's some good research out there by a PhD by the name of Kevin Wolves from the University of Champaign-Urbana, and he just did his dissertation on woody agriculture. And what he showed is that actually savannas, believe it or not, store the most carbon because they maximize photosynthetic productivity. So it's not necessarily grassland or forest, but a mix of three-dimensional, trees, shrubs, forbs, things of that nature to create the different levels so that you can maximize that photosynthetic productivity.
And I would also add, Paul Hawkins' book, Project Drawdown, really highlights the value of silvopasture, as did our carbon farm plan. And so it's something that I would echo where, from a productivity standpoint, but also an ecological function standpoint, those sort of mosaic landscapes have an incredible potential.
Hi, sorry about that. I think people ask this question a lot, which is like, how do I get the most carbon? And which is great, but it's kind of more, the question is, what land am I working on? And what's going to be most beneficial for this landscape and for my specific operation? And so I think oftentimes we get really narrow into these conversations about, oh, well, forests are better than grasslands, or savannas are best. And it's like, that's true from a standpoint of what we know now, that savanna has that stacked function, and the silvopasture you see above and below ground carbon storage. But I don't think it's the right functional question to ask. The right functional question is, what's the landscape I'm in? What does it need to thrive and be healthy? How can I support its photosynthetic capacity and the diversity in that system? And also create a product off of that land that's going to sustain an agricultural operation and keep those people on the land. So we use carbon here, again, I reiterate, because we have a funding source in California that rewards us per ton of carbon. And it's a great metric to track because it helps us keep track of the other functions like water and nitrogen and nutrients that stack on it. But I would just encourage you all to not go away looking for the thing that's the best. Like, is compost application the best or riparian restoration the best? It's what's going to work best for your system that's going to make it thrive, because we have to start wherever we are on the landscapes that we're in, and we all need to be doing this work, healing those landscapes.
All right, in the back over here.
A practical question for Russell and both of you, Kevin. I'm wondering what deworming process you use and vaccination, knowing that the dung beetle, the whole cycle stops once you use Ivomax. If you can speak to that.
Questions about worming? Deworming programs? Yeah, currently we're doing a deworming program, and I really want to get off it, but I really need to understand how to get off it and the consequences of doing that. So one of the first things I want to do is start using Safeguard, which doesn't kill the dung beetles, but I really want to encourage the dung beetle population. And then from there, as I have healthier soils, as I'm not grazing so short, in the past in the history we're grazing short, and in the bottom like 3 inches is where the parasites hang out. So as long as we're grazing higher up on the plant, then I'm going to be knowing that I'm doing this safely, and then I can slowly to convert over to not doing internal pesticide control. Does that answer your question?
Yeah, we didn't use any dewormers, just for you.
I got to serve as the land and livestock manager during the years that we were transitioning from using dewormers, and it really followed that sort of cycle that setting this audacious goal and like really rigorously tracking and breeding and ecological monitoring and picking through a lot of cow pies was a huge help for us. And the way that we essentially started it was, if we had to use dewormers, we would know what fields had the most sensitive or important communities of insects. And typically speaking, about 7 to 14 days after the application, the potency has fallen off so significantly. So we're now at a point where we aren't using those products, but we saw that we could start growing dung beetle population in insect diversity even while we were using it, simply by being very knowledgeable about where we put animals after they had been wormed.
Back here to the left.
Thank you. Can you hear me? Okay, so great. I want to ask you about your markets and your financial planning and what you would have to have. We've heard price on water. I'm assuming you're in a commercial market where your livestock. There's fiber markets out there. What do you have to have as far as your return? What does the market have to pay you? And how do you calculate what you need the price of carbon to make your model work, make your finances work?
Good question. So I'm going to just talk a little bit about the fiber market because that's where there was a little bit more research done on that, and that was about 60 cents per pound of wool produced, in addition to receiving full EQIP funding for these practices that covered the gap in that space. We're also doing some modeling looking at if you get EQIP funding plus the state healthy soils funding, which is about double what you get for EQIP, what's the gap that remains for the farmer to cover cost of implementation for practices and then get a small premium on this. That Strauss Family Dairy is doing that on the dairy side, and we have some folks on the beef side. We don't have numbers out yet, but we'll be putting them up on the Marine Carbon Project website when we do, so we can share that with you then. I think realistically, you're not going to get the cost covered totally on value add because these are pretty base commodities, as you know, and so you're not going to get that price increase. What we've seen in a lot of cases is either coupled funding subsidies over time and or the companies that a lot of some of the producers work with are now doing something in their supply chains called insetting, where instead of buying offsets, they're actually going into their supply chain and investing in it. So Pendleton and North Face on the fiber shed side of things invested in their very large ranchers creating compost piles on site, like very large compost operations, and that then brought down the compost application price for those farmers. So we're seeing both, you need a combination of the subsidies plus a market value, plus maybe some help from the supply chain side of things to really get those direct investments on the ground. Frankly, if we had a stronger carbon market, you might be able to get a price on the carbon that would make sense, but right now we've got about $8 to $12 per ton, and for this type of work you need about $30 to get that really to make sense for folks. So the answer is it's not easy, but we're building it in scale, and we're going to have to shift the economic system to reward it more.
Yeah, in my business planning process, by no way am I just looking to farm the incentives or the subsidies. I just think that the programs like Payment for Ecosystem Services will really accelerate what I want to do. But from a just traditional agricultural, agronomic perspective, I'm trying to value add as much as I can with my next operation. And all the businesses that I've researched, and see Mike Callicrate back there in the back, he's doing a great job value adding all the way to the end product, to the end consumer. And I can see the success of his operation and a bunch of direct-to-retail operations in California. We have a huge population with a lot of disposable income. So I'm looking to take advantage of that by going direct to the consumer.
And I would just add that as quantification becomes cheaper and easier to sort of show consumers, that we'll certainly see, I hope, more of that higher price per pound. But I would also add that what's neat about this, at least from what we've observed in California with the Mediterranean climate and such, is that there's also the other side of increasing pounds per acre. So there's sort of this dual sort of benefit of, yes, hopefully you can capture either a higher carbon payment or a niche market, but you should, I'm hoping that we'll also see increases in productivity and resiliency.
Far right side of the room, or this side of the room.
Hello, everybody.
My name is Hinala Carrio, and I'm representing Acma Pueblo, a former student from Mississippi. Anyway, I just wanted to ask a question. I'm familiar with like soils, that's what I'm taking. And I was wondering if you guys do like land management surveying as well as like finding out like the horizons and like your formations and functions. And as well as like microbe organizing. And I was just wondering if you guys got any familiar information about that. Because I know where I'm from, the Pueblo of Acoma, we do a lot of land surveying, and then we measure out throughout the land like grazed grasses and non-grazed grasses, and which like maybe switch them off every 2 years, like cattle from different locations for like the soil to regain its nutrients, as well as like as well as like carbon, and like how respiration and photosynthesis is kind of like the same thing. I was wondering if you guys like do like the same familiar things, like as for like farming, like switching off your your plots, and even for animals, like switching off your animals at different locations so the soil could reform its like actual nutrients. And I was just wondering if you guys are familiar with anything like land surveying and managing. I know California is like a big land of like grassland and forests, so I was just really interested and wanted to know.
Thanks for the question. You look like a millennial like me, so I'll just tell you to Google soil information system. It's really interesting, some of the mapping and heat maps that they're putting out. I think the 2-foot soil course that they're doing now only costs about $30 per acre. It's still expensive if you're not a real commercial producer, but the data that they're able to put out in combination with proper soil testing, I think is really interesting. That's one thing that I'm following a lot. And, you might enjoy as well, being that you're probably technologically adverse, like myself.
Yeah, we absolutely use the information service, the soil information service, and to your point, it's critical that we track where animals have been, when, in what density, and for us, it's really important to say that the same pasture isn't grazed during the winter 2 seasons in a row. That can have a really big impact on our sort of output later on. So I think you're absolutely right. It's critical to be tracking that. It's critical to understand this dynamic system. And so I applaud you for any way that you can increase your sensitivity to that process, because it will make you a better manager by far.
We did use pasture map when I was grazing. That's a good way to monitor where your cattle have been, where you want them to go, and how many animal days per acre were in those specific paddocks.
All right, well, everyone, just give a warm round of applause. Thank you so much, panelists.